right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to those of you. We've had a little hiatus since Network 2020 was doing its big fundraising, but we are very happy to be back today in the first of our Network 2020's Democracy series. Really quickly, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, a few words about Network 2020. We are a New York-based nonprofit. We are an inclusive international community that's really trying to bridge the gap between the private sector and foreign policy worlds, and really trying to look at innovative solutions to critical foreign policy challenges. And so one of our many programs is this virtual briefing series, which reaches people in over 90 countries, and in which, especially during the pandemic, we are lucky to be able to bring really wonderful experts to speak to us. And so these briefings are free and open to all around the world. This series that we're doing today, or the briefing that we're doing today, is the first in the series that we're pulling together. So we'll be doing about one per month, just really looking at the state of democracy. And so we wanted to kick off by really taking a good look at why the US is doing this. And just, I wanted to say a few words before I introduce our guest. As I think many of you know, democracy has been the topic of much debate recently. And for years, experts have been warning of the democracy decline at the expense of growing autocrats. And on a personal note, I grew up in an era where the antithesis to democracy was communism. And at the time, both the pull of cultural freedom and the economic gains enabled by democracies were a potent pull. But today, I think a lot of democracies face some internal challenges. I think we're all in the US are still thinking a lot about January 6th here, as well as external ones. China has taken a very different path from the Soviet Union, and its ability to pull, I think it's 850 million people out of extreme poverty, makes for a very different script than the one during Soviet times. And so, with the idea that preserving and promoting democratic values is a pillar of US security, when we look back over the past decades, we find many examples of democracy promotion that's gone awry, whether it's conducted militarily or sometimes even when we're using tools such as development and diplomacy and integration into multilateral institutions. So we really wanted to kick off this series taking a look at how should the United States approach a valid goal of preserving democratic values at home and abroad, while still operating within a much more complex paradigm, I would say. So this is the briefing that we'll have today. Just one caveat, the discussion today is featuring speakers who are from the United States, who are based in the United States. We are aware that this decision narrows the scope of a discussion in a way, but throughout the course of this series, we will be featuring speakers from other countries, so we will get that perspective as well. And with that, I wanted to introduce our wonderful speakers. We have, first we have Danielle Pletka, or Dani, as I've been given permission to call her, who is a really wonderful voice on foreign policy. She comes from both the government side, having worked as a senior professional staff member for the Middle East and South Asia on the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, also has been at American Enterprise Institute, working a lot on Middle East and defense issues as well. As you can see, she has authored many things that you can read, and is also the host of a podcast, What the Hell is Going On? So worth checking out. And we also have Stephen Walt, who really, I think, is another person who needs no introduction. He is at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is one of those voices that I have long admired in foreign policy for often taking sometimes unpopular positions, but always with a very clear reasoning. And so I think he's a really wonderful voice in the foreign policy community, as well as the author of many books, as well as a contributing editor at Foreign Policy. So a lot of places to check out his work. And so with that, I think I would like to actually launch the discussion for why we are all here. So Steve, turning to you first. We are at a critical moment in the health and vitality of democracies and subsequently US efforts to promote democracy. Can you just start us off by putting this in context? And how do you see this moment fitting into the history of democratic systems and U.S. efforts to promote democracy?
Well, it's definitely a sort of a critical moment, but we've had moments like this in the past. Americans tend to think of course, democracy as the normal condition, but it is actually something of an unusual condition. A majority of the world's countries have never been democratic. And in fact, a majority of the world's people have never lived under a democratic system. So in that sense, democracy is not the norm. It's a bit unusual. That said, the trend, if you take the long historical view, has been in a democratic direction. There are at most a handful of democratic countries in the 19th century, and then you get a sort of first wave after World War I, the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany with the Weimar Republic, and so the number of democracies takes a big jump forward. Unfortunately, then in the 1930s, you see a backsliding back towards authoritarianism. A second wave occurs after World War II with decolonization, a number of countries becoming independent from the European colonies. Some of them become democratic. And then you get another period of backsliding with a number of democracies declines. The third wave begins with the end of the Cold War, the breakup of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, lots of countries becoming independent and becoming democratic. But for the past 15 years or so, we've seen yet another backsliding. According to Freedom House, which is a New York-based think tank, the last 14 years have seen a net decline in the level of freedom in the world, 14 consecutive years. And even The Economist magazine, which is a pretty pro-American publication, downgraded the United States in its annual democracy index from being a full democracy to what it calls a flawed democracy. And again, if we think of recent events in the United States, you can understand why. So I guess what I'm saying is that the trend, if you take a very long view, is in a pro-democratic direction, but the pendulum does swing back and forth over time, even if the overall trend has been a positive one.
All right, great, thank you very much for that. Do you think, just to follow up briefly, because that was a very good tour of the last century plus. So do you think that this is something to worry about, or is this just sort of the normal state of affairs?
I think it is something to worry about because there's no guarantee, of course, that the pendulum will then move back in the direction that we'd like. And we also want to learn from the things that have been done well and the things that have been done poorly. I also want to add one important distinction. I think it's important to understand the difference between a democratic system and what we think of as a liberal democracy. By liberal, I don't mean left-wing or anything like that. Democracy just refers to the mechanism by which leaders are chosen. Are they chosen in relatively free elections? Liberal democracy means a few other things as well. Commitment to certain basic rights, commitment to the rule of law in a reasonably objective way, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. There's a whole package of other institutions. So you can have a formally democratic system where you have elections and you even count the votes accurately, but it's not a truly liberal system because it doesn't necessarily safeguard rights, safeguard speech. I would say that, countries like Hungary, Poland, maybe India are all democracies, genuine democracies, but not necessarily liberal democracies in their current condition.
Thank you for that clarification. Danny, turning to you, as I mentioned in the intro, democracy promotion has been, I would say, a staple of U.S. foreign policy and security policy. What's our scorecard on that over time? And it often seems like we've gotten those efforts more wrong than right. What's your take on U.S. democracy promotion efforts, and why have we gotten it wrong? What do you recommend going forward? Could you just lay that out a little bit for us, please?
So first of all, thank you, Courtney. Thanks for having me. And look, you just asked a question that has been the subject of many books, let alone a quick answer at the top of an event. But let me try and separate this out. I think one thing that Steve says that's important to understand is that you do need to take a long view of such things. Our view of things has shortened as the years have passed. So where we used to take a year-long view, we now take a day-long view and forget what happened yesterday. And that's a big product of advances in technology, but it does cause a loss of perspective. So, I mean, if you want to talk about, our track record, let's not even call it our track record, call it the track record of liberal democracies against bad guys, then the last century is really not bad. Right? The victory in World War II, the victory in the Cold War, both of those really were, pivotal inflection points for us and for the values and the ideas that we hold dear. As Steve rightly says, is everything perfect? I think, what did Frank Fukuyama say in the early 1990s? Oh yeah, we're all done with history now. Yeah, I'm not quite sure he was right about that. And, we are always plagued by that short-term triumphalism. We've done great. Oh yeah, it's not actually great. And I think that if you look to that, that's actually one of the reasons why we've struggled with the idea of democracy promotion. Let's divide it up into a few things. So, where we have fought a war and defeated the enemy, right? Absolutely and completely, and basically begun with what is, let's say, close to a tabula rasa, Japan, South Korea, other places like that, sure. Right? Even those took decades to become full democracies. Taiwan, decades to become full democracies. Even, really up to a half a century we're talking about. This was not a short period of time. And in other instances, where we have sought to promote democracy, we have really faltered. Again, not so much because the idea of democracy promotion is bad. I think it would be very hard to argue objectively that democracy is not better than authoritarianism, that democracy is not better than totalitarianism, that both economic and political and religious and civil freedoms are better. That's a value judgment, and I'm very comfortable with that. But for the United States, I think there's not only been a lack of consistency, there's been a certain lack of comfort with that. Where our friends in Europe were colonial powers used to bossing around their various subjects, the Americans really don't like landing in a country and telling people how to be. That's just an anecdotal observation on my part, but I think it really is borne out. And when I say they don't like to tell people how to be, I mean they don't even like to make these sort of judgments that I just made about things that are better. In other words, gee, it's better to have religious freedom than it is to have no religious freedom. So you won't find our ambassador in Saudi Arabia railing against the lack of religious freedom there, despite the fact that this is one of the values that America should be standing for. So that's part of the challenge. The second part of the challenge is that while we spend a great deal of money, we spend it incredibly inconsistently. So the amount of spending on democracy promotion by both AID, the Agency for International Development, the State Department, and others has skyrocketed over the decades. So, we're talking about billions of dollars now. And yet the ability to find effective ways to spend that money is really not within our reach. And we can point to wonderful stories, transformative stories about, women who opened businesses, about newspapers, about TV stations, about rights that were extended. But at the end of the day, those are really just anecdotal stories. We are not great at figuring out how to systematically help societies build institutions, particularly in the face of a government that is not interested in us doing that. The other challenge for us, and this is one of those sort of glaringly obvious things, and yet we've never really figured out how to reconcile it, is that our Department of State, right, our foreign ministry, is on the one hand in charge of our government's relations with foreign countries, which are necessary at the even the worst of times. So the State Department, and the State Department, our ambassador to China, is the guy in charge of our relationship with China, right? And that's not just about the Uyghurs, right? And it's not just about Hong Kong. It's about all those things. And yet that same guy is also in charge of democracy promotion in that country. These are irreconcilables. And we haven't figured out how to live that balance. The last word on this, I would say, is we're not terribly good at incrementalism, right? We tend to want it all, be a democracy now. And we fail to understand that, as Bernard Lewis said, I think one of, the sort of the most simple, but one of the most trenchant things he said is, democracies do not begin with elections. Elections are the culmination of a democratic process. But we get bored with all that interim stuff. We want to see you have a vote, and then we want to, cheer about your vote. And we don't really give a damn if that vote represents exactly the same thing that it did prior to the introduction of democratic norms. We don't care that lots of people who don't embrace democracy are part of that vote. We're just excited that there was a vote. And so these are the challenges that we face. And I would say that we have not either found good answers to them, nor really debated them honestly in the body politic.
Yeah, I suppose structural changes like rule of law and other things don't quite have the same photo op as an inked finger or something of the sort. But just to follow up on that a little bit, Steve, turning to you, Danny had mentioned just sometimes it's about the length of time, right? And looking at, say, Iraq and Afghanistan, is that comparable to, say, South Korea and Japan? Have we just not let enough time go by, or is there something that, either the time period is different, the place is different, our approach is different that we should be thinking of?
Yeah, well, there are obviously some success stories here, and Danny mentioned some of them. Everyone's favorite stories, of course, are West Germany and Japan after World War II, where the United States did occupy both countries, and over time brought relatively quickly pretty effective democratic systems into being. Those are also unusual cases in a number of ways. These were relatively modern societies. Japan, very ethnically homogeneous. Germany after World War II, also more ethnically homogeneous, high literacy rates, high levels of per capita income. And both of those countries had some experience with democratic institutions beforehand, more so in Germany than Japan, but even in Japan, there were some there. So there was a reasonably fertile soil in which to then construct a set of institutions as well. It's also important to remember in both cases, the United States in coming in didn't dismantle all of the existing institutions. Local governing institutions in Germany were largely preserved. The emperor was retained in Japan as an important sort of symbol of national unity as well. So in a sense, those were success stories, but they were success stories where the conditions were quite favorable. And they were also, very importantly, two countries that were actually worried about the Soviet Union after World War II, and therefore wanted a close relationship with the United States. The other, I think, great success story is South Korea, precisely because it begins as a military dictatorship, remains a dictatorship for many decades, while being a close American ally. The United States does not try to force South Korea to become a democracy, although that was clearly something we wanted. We rather gently nudged them over time, and were very patient. And ultimately, the impetus for democratic transition in South Korea came from the South Koreans, with, of course, the United States welcoming the development, but not trying to force the pace, not trying to impose it. I think where we get into trouble, of course, is when we try to do this overnight. And in particular, when we try to do it by first invading a country, particularly a country unlike Germany and Japan that hasn't started the war, right? And then we dismantle all of the existing institutions in societies that were already deeply divided. Think Iraq, think Afghanistan, think Libya as well. And then we're engaged in a massive project of social engineering in a place that we usually don't understand very well, where we don't know the elites, we don't know the culture, we don't have enough people in our government who speak the relevant languages. And we have to bear in mind that by going in there, knocking down the door and ripping the place apart, we've created a bunch of winners, people who are going to be better off in this circumstance. We've also created a bunch of losers, people who used to be in power and aren't anymore, and they're usually not very happy about it. And they're often in a position to then make life very difficult for whoever the occupying power is. By the way, this is not unique to the United States, right? Other imperial powers have had exactly the same problem, especially once nationalism really spreads around the world. I mean, again, the big difference between our experience in recent years and, say, the British or the French when they ran these vast colonial empires was the British and the French, in the 18th century didn't have to deal with local nationalism in India asking them to get the hell out. Right. I think what we've seen throughout the 20th century is that big multinational empires have real trouble precisely because different national groups within them want to govern themselves. And that same allergy to foreign interference operates when the United States, even with the best of intentions, goes into a place like Afghanistan and tries to re-engineer the culture, re-engineer the political institutions. So a lot of this is understanding sort of what American power and influence can do and what the circumstances have to be in which it's likely to be successful. I should just add one other point here is I do think the other thing we know, and we know this from earlier waves when democracy has spread, is the power of a good example. And as I think you said in your introductory remarks, the United States, when it was seen as a beacon of freedom, as economically successful, as a political system that worked well, despite some differences, obviously, that made other people look around and say, gee, we'd like something like that in our society, appropriately adapted to, our particular culture and conditions. When the United States looks like it doesn't know what it's doing, it can't handle a pandemic, its political system doesn't work no matter who's in charge, et cetera, that makes it much harder to go around the world and say, hey, we've got a great political system, you should have something like it too. That's a harder sell to make, say, right now than it was in 1993 with the Soviet Union collapsing and the United States in pretty good shape.
Thank you. I wanted to just follow up quickly on that with, we talked about some of the cases where we've done military intervention, and that's been the reason that we've gone in. What about the idea of integration into some of the clubs, EU, WTO, even NATO maybe? Because I think sometimes that's maybe used a bit as a carrot. Has that had that same desired effect, Steve?
Yes, in some cases. I think there's no question that the desire to qualify for NATO membership, and I think even more importantly, the desire of some Eastern European countries to qualify for membership in the European Union was a very important impetus for these countries to then write constitutions that protected minority rights, that guaranteed democratic institutions. It was a really powerful carrot to have access to the European market as well. So that did help. Unfortunately, you also see the limits of that. Sort of once you're in the club, you've done the work, then the question is, can you hang on to it? And what we've seen in the cases of Hungary and Poland, two countries that have headed back the other way, is that the European Union doesn't have an effective mechanism for disciplining those countries, or in an extreme case, expelling them if they really do appear to depart from the democratic norms on which the European Union is supposed to be based. Problem being is it requires a unanimous vote of the European Union members to discipline or expel a member. And in this case, Poland and Hungary will each veto any effort to go after the other. So in a sense, they've been able to move in an illiberal direction quite openly in the case of Hungary without the EU being able to do anything effectively to correct it. Also, the other example here, of course, that Turkey did adopt a number of fairly significant domestic reforms in order to try and qualify for European Union membership. But that ultimately didn't work. They didn't get in. And my guess is, had they been admitted to the European Union, they would now be a third case of a country that had gone back in a more illiberal direction, having once gotten inside the club. So club membership, it can be an important tool, but it is by no means an ironclad guarantee.
Thank you. Danny, several speakers at Network 2020's past briefings, when talking about the relationship between the US and China, have underscored that this is not a new Cold War, in part because China lacks the ideological drive of the Soviet Union. Yet we also seem, in this current environment, is that Russia and China are using nationalism instead of spreading ideology. So, could you just talk a little bit about the new ism between democracies and autocracies? Is nationalism that new ism? What effect will that have?
I'm glad you're reserving all of these easy questions for me, Courtney. I would much rather have talked about the EU and NATO. Look, it's absolutely true. I wrote a piece about this for Foreign Policy's 50th anniversary edition. It's much. First of all, just look at it from our own public's perspective. It's much more difficult to stir people up about the challenge that Chinese nationalism poses. Just as we understand it's wrapped up with a whole bunch of other very problematic behaviors, but the notion that, for example, Americans should get excited about the Belt and Road project, right? No, they don't, right? And I think similarly, as far as Russia is concerned, I think there is an ideological element, but there's also this nationalist element. It simply does not have, dare I call it, the magic of the anti-communist fight in the eyes of the public, and that is a factor in building a constituency for doing something about the threat that these countries pose. And I would say much more seriously, obviously, the threat that China poses, because we really are unfamiliar with this kind of an adversary. We are unused to facing up to a country that we are very much economically intertwined with, that we wish to continue to be economically intertwined with, that we had long hoped would be sort of bound by the fetters of all of these global rules of the road, the WTO, et cetera, and yet is a country that has used its wealth to make strategic advances that are frankly anathema to us and our allies in the South China Sea, but potentially in the East China Sea as well, vis-a-vis Taiwan. And so the question of what to do is truly fraught. And I think that you saw this confusion that played out very nicely over the Huawei question, right? Here is a company that was basically founded by regime insiders, former People's Liberation Army honchos, that it engages in government-directed espionage. And yet when the United States basically went to our allies and said, hey, don't do this, bad idea, they kind of came back at us and said, one, okay, what should we do instead? What have you got? And we said, duh. And in addition, really couldn't see their way to agreeing with us for a whole variety of reasons, many of them being economic, right? Huawei is cheaper than the alternatives, than the Qualcomm alternative in particular. Okay, so that was sort of part one. What I think helped change minds. And I think that this sort of, if you think of foreign policy as a giant aircraft carrier, I always find that a very good analogy, not because we want to go and invade with it, but because turning it is really hard and slow and requires these degrees and incremental changes. But I do think that over the last 4 years, we've seen that change in global attitudes towards China. Not complete, certainly not among our friends, the Germans, but very much of a change in attitudes. And what really contributed to that was the Chinese handling of COVID, right? If COVID-19 had not come along, I would say we would still be having Huawei level arguments, back and forth, leaning on people, yes, no, maybe. Now, there's a different attitude because there's a realization that the implications of what a government does at home and how it manages at home with secrecy, with fear, with lies, actually has implications for our health. I mean, we've lost 500,000 people. Right? In the United States alone. Would that have been different if China had been more transparent, if there had not been a Chinese candidate at the head of the World Health Organization? So all of those things have helped to change attitudes. But of course, what we used to call the $64,000 question, not really a $64,000 question anymore, maybe we should call it a $64 billion question, is what do we do about it? And there, I think that there's a real, lack of consensus. So, you have Donald Trump and you have Joe Biden who agree, this is a challenge. We need to face up to it for economic, for political, for military reasons. What should we do? Not really sure. And that's a big problem for us going forward, let alone talking about the challenge of China internally, China's role in promoting anti-democratic regimes abroad, and the whole question of China, and its own governance at home.
Thank you. And thank you for taking these tough questions. I give them to you because I know you can handle them. So really
that was
quickly,
very smooth, very smooth indeed.
Before we go to the audience Q&A, I had one question that I hope both of you might want to take a crack at. And so just looking at the impacts that democracy promotion has at home. We're obviously, as we've mentioned, having this discussion at a critical time for our own democracy. Would either of you want to comment on how democracy promotion affects domestic policy and how the American public views these international actions?
I'll take a swing at it. It's a little bit speculative, right? The connections between sort of what's happening abroad and the condition of democracy at home the connections there are sometimes a little bit obscure. But I think that some of our efforts abroad have actually had a negative effect on the state of democratic health here in the country. I mean, first of all, we haven't been doing very well at it. And when you fail, over an extended period of time, that inevitably makes people, question how the institutions here are functioning. It also just eats up a lot of bandwidth. The fact that we're still debating, should we be in Afghanistan or not? And if so, how? 20 years after we first entered there, just eats up some part of the conversation. Second, I think the recent waves of democracy efforts, have required a certain amount of deception by elites, and this is elites from both parties. I think the Bush administration misled the country into the war in Iraq. Both Republicans and Democrats repeatedly exaggerated the progress we were making in places like Afghanistan, certainly true in the Obama years and in the Trump years and in the Bush years. And I think ultimately this contributes to a lack of trust in government. When suddenly the truth comes out and it's discovered that people inside the Pentagon were saying all along, we're not doing very well here in Afghanistan, even though the public story was different, that fuels this idea that you can't trust what government officials are telling you, which in turn makes it easier to indulge in the kind of conspiracy theorizing that has been eating away at American politics in a variety of ways. We also, I think, don't want to forget the economic effects. right? The costs of the greater war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan, and related events, easily exceeding $6 trillion. And we could all disagree and debate what could have been done with that money, but you can imagine lots of different things being done here, either to leave it in the taxpayers' pockets or to rebuild infrastructure or to do any number of other desirable things. And that money has gone away. And to some of the sort of populist wave that has roiled American politics has, I think, been due to different communities in the United States being neglected because we were busy doing other things elsewhere as well. That's not the only part of the problem, but I think it is a part of it. James Madison once wrote that no nation can maintain its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. And to the extent that some of the warfare we've been doing has been under the aegis of trying to spread democracy, I think that captures what we should be worrying about here, which is that a country in constant military campaigns in lots of different places inevitably see the executive get stronger, the executive not tell the people the truth, and gradually that's not only going to undermine the health of democratic institutions, it's going to lead more and more people to not trust what government officials are doing, and that's ultimately not healthy either.
So I disagree with most of what Steve just said, but I don't think it's in any way fun or entertaining for our audience for us to get into a back and forth about this. The one thing that I will agree with is that I think there's been an erosion of faith in government and in institutions of government, and there are a lot of different reasons for that. Understanding what they are, I think, is important, and failure is definitely one of them, for sure. But it's not the only. It's not the only one. But I also think that this argument has been rather disingenuously overdrawn. I keep hearing, and I keep hearing it, and I'm from Freedom House as well, and they know well how I feel about their assessments on these things, that our democracy is in the process of erosion. I got to say, we had one of the most dishonest, one of the least respectful of democracy presidents in recent history in the White House for 4 years. Someone who was comfortable lying to the American body politic, who was comfortable lying about the results of the election. And I would argue, and I think that the results, bear this out, that our democratic institutions bore up extraordinarily well under that threat, extraordinarily well, including by people who were appointed themselves by Donald Trump, just in case you guys didn't know what I was talking about. Thought I might be talking about Bill Clinton, but no, I meant Donald Trump. If you look at the court cases, if you look at Republican officials, Democratic officials, the Supreme Court, the Vice President, our Congress, all of these really withstood the threat, I would say, with extraordinary resilience, to use that popular word. And that gave me more faith in our democracy. Sure, Steve is totally right. There's a lot more conspiracy theorizing. There's a lot more atomization in our country. And I would say not just in our country, everywhere. That is corrosive, and corrosive to public debate, corrosive to comity, corrosive to democratic processes in a lot of ways. But nonetheless, I think we have been tested, and I think we've come out really extraordinarily well. I also think it's important to understand that while many of the conflicts of the last 20 years have been couched in terms of a battle for democracy for a whole variety of reasons, of course, the reason we went into Afghanistan was not to spread democracy to the benighted Afghans. It was because 3,000 people were killed on 9/11, and the place that it was planned and executed from was in Afghanistan. We can, and I don't want to open up the door to an argument about Iraq, but I would only say that our aims in Iraq, at least at the outset, were certainly not related to democracy, because there were plenty of other places, frankly, that were far more crappy authoritarian regimes than Saddam Hussein's. So, you know, you had an intersection of issues. The only thing I would point to for people is that in this erosion of democracy globally, that I think Steve and I both agreed about and that we've talked about, we see opportunities for bad guys that are not the bad guys that we are talking about in this session, right? It's not the Russians and the Chinese, although they may be free riders. It is the same kind of sub-state actors who actually drew us into Afghanistan in the first place. And one of the results of neglecting, you know, we don't have to call it democratization. We can call it, you know, we can call it basic foreign policy. But one of the byproducts of neglecting this is that groups like that do provide alternatives. They do provide the kinds of governance, not that we like, but that is sometimes necessary in places like Somalia, and places like Yemen, and places like Syria, and in places like Nigeria, and places like Mali. I could go on for quite a long time. And these countries, right, small countries, you know, what did Neville Chamberlain say? You know, those countries, right, of which we know little, they have the opportunity to again assault us in ways that will cause us to forget about all of this discussion and only remember the way we felt on the day after 9/11. So, you know, there's a balance here that is necessary, but pretending that somehow we don't have a dog in any of these fights, I think is misleading and dangerous.
Thank you. So we're getting a lot of questions in the Q&A box, and I'll start with two of the first actually that are asking somewhat of a similar question. And Danny, maybe I'll keep you on this because it seems to be a thread that you were just talking about. And so the question is, you know, just trying to summarize them, is really like, is it worth it? You know, defending democracy has led to wars and death in distant countries. Was it worthwhile?
Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. So, you know, I don't think either of us would disagree that the American entry into World War II was the right thing to do. You can find a couple of books who argue against that, a couple of authors who would argue against that, but I think on balance, for both good strategic reasons and also for moral reasons, that was clearly a fight worth having. I think the American entry into the Korean War was also perfectly reasonable for strategic and also larger reasons, even though South Korea wasn't a democracy and didn't become one for another 40 years or so, 30 to 40 years or so. So in some cases, it's definitely been worthwhile. In other cases, it seems to me it has not been. And there it's in part because the United States either entered wars misunderstanding what was going on, or exaggerated its ability to enter a war, defeat an adversary, and create an acceptable political solution at the end. We didn't, as Danny said, we didn't go to Afghanistan in 2001-2 because we wanted to suddenly transform it into a democracy. We went there to go after Al-Qaeda. We stayed there for the next 18 years or more in order to try and turn the place into a democracy, even when it became clear that that effort was not succeeding. And we somehow could not find our way to extricate ourselves in a reasonable way at an acceptable cost. We're going to end up with the same outcome we would have had in 2009 or 2014 or 2017 or 2020 or 25 or whenever we do get out. We've just been unable to find a way to pull the plug. But I don't think you can make a sort of general statement that, fighting to defend democracy is always a good thing or never a good thing. I think you have to judge these pretty much on a case-by-case basis. And the ones where we're successful tend to be those where there are really genuine strategic interests and where the conditions for reinforcing or establishing a democracy are already there, and we're not having to invent them after we go in.
Danny, do you want to add anything to that? Thanks.
If we have a lot of questions,
yeah, we do a lot of questions.
Bounce back and forth because we've only got another 15 minutes.
I know. Sorry, I took too much time. There are a couple of questions that are asking for solutions. So one from John Allen, who's very impressed with your analysis, but really would like to know if you have any fresh ideas. And rolling into that, I have a question from Anna Sattler, who asks, how should the US and other liberal democracies address and/or counter Chinese influence and promotion of autocratic regimes in underdeveloped regions, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia? Danny, do you want to take a stab at that first?
Do I have any fresh ideas? I mean, look, we all think we have fresh ideas, but the honest truth is there are very few fresh ideas. The real issue is the execution on those ideas. You know, there's no magical silver bullet here, and the other problem that faces us, of course, is that each of these countries presents a different challenge, and you know, there is no one size fits all democracy t-shirt that we can ship out and just hope for the best. You know, one of the things that I've written repeatedly and will continue to write is that I think that the Helsinki process that we embraced towards the latter decades of the Cold War was something that was, I think, effective. Now, you know, victory had many different fathers, but I think that it was a good way for us to keep these issues on the front burner, if you will. What does that mean? It means that in our interactions with each of these countries, we bring up the democracy and the human rights issues. In other words, they don't get left behind ever. You know, it's not, oh no, we're just here to talk about, you know, trade in beef lips. That's actually a thing, by the way. No, while we're here talking to you, we want you to know we're watching what you're doing in Xinjiang. We watched what you did in Hong Kong. There will be consequences to this. We're happy to talk to you about this individual issues, but don't think that you, China, can separate everything else off, because you can't. Even doing that, which isn't going to free a single Uyghur, which isn't going to get our 2 Canadian friends out of prison, you know, which isn't going to stop Iran's march to the bomb, it isn't going to stop them from hanging underage so-called criminals. You know, even doing that, I think, would be an advance on the way we do things now. We do not, in fact, bring these issues up at every turn. It is not a piece of our calculus when we are talking about bilateral or multilateral relations. And you know, for me, that's just a basic start. You know, that our officials, that our embassy officials, that our economic officials, that these are the issues that they bring up in every single meeting. You know, I mean, again, I don't think that any of that is going to result in a magical solution, but I do think that it is going to do more to keep these issues at the forefront than we have heretofore done in a lot of these situations. And I can say that just from having sat with, you know, ambassador after ambassador in these dictatorships and not having seen them push back on absolutely outrageous statements and predations against these countries' own people. So, you know, there's one small idea. There was a second part to the question, and I'm sorry I was super verbose. What was it?
I was trying to combine 2 questions, but we're really looking. One was more broadly at solutions, and the other was looking in particular at how to counter Chinese influence and promotion of autocratic regimes.
Which I think, again, I think, you know, I mean, Steve and I may see this differently, but this is just a short thing. You know, calling these things out is the first step to doing something about them. The reality is that if you look at, for example, how our friends the Germans behave on these issues, they don't call out the Chinese. You know, they reserve it to a couple of little soft statements here and there because they're too busy worrying about their bilateral trade relations. So even that, I think, is a good step. But maybe Steve.
No, I was going to say there actually is some good news here, and then I'll give an answer to the second part of the question. I mean, you know, I said during the Trump administration that the Chinese and the United States were competing to see which country could lose influence faster, and because in fact both countries were doing things that armed, worried, bothered other countries. And that, I think, has continued in the Chinese case. It's not just Huawei, although that has been an issue. It's also what's happened in Hong Kong. It's also what's happening with the Uyghurs. It's also the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, this very aggressive diplomatic style of berating others as well. And all of this, of course, has alarmed other countries that maybe a decade ago would have been saying, well, China is developing in its own way and they're a constructive force in world affairs, et cetera. And that's something that if you're worried about Chinese influence is actually a good sign that the rest of the world has started to notice that. In terms of the creative solution, I mean, I think one has to recognize that China is going to be a major player in world politics regardless. Its influence is going to be considerable, and the best way to deal with that is, first of all, for the United States to make sure that it retains a similar or greater level of influence. That means maintaining a large, healthy, productive, growing, innovative economy as well. So this is one of those, and also a political system here at home that starts to work better, work in some of the ways it used to 20, 30, 40 years ago as well. So we're in one of those wonderful moments where actually getting our act together at home is something that would be good for all Americans and would be good for our international influence and our ability to turn democracy into a more marketable product again, where I think it has taken some hits in recent years.
Thank you. I just had a quick clarification question. Danny, I'll throw this one at you. And it's about how you all are defining nationalism and whether or not it's whether or not resistance to colonialism and imperialism is a modern phenomenon. And are you defining nationalism in a way that excludes historical resistance? It's just a quick definitional question, but I wanted to get it right for the listeners. Your thoughts?
I'm not going to touch
was
it.
the one who brought nationalism is simply the belief that there's a group of people that form a single people. It's their collective belief that they are all one type and that they want to govern themselves, right? That we people here in this country are all one community and we should be allowed to govern our own affairs and not be ruled by people who are different than us in some fundamental way. We Americans do not want people coming from Pakistan and telling us how to run our country. That's basically what nationalism is.
Thank you. We have a question from Joanna Voschowski about how have U.S. corporations played a role in democracy promotion? And as companies have become much more multinational, has this changed? Danny, do you want to take that? Any thoughts on corporations, role of corporation?
I mean, it's in lots of ways. The globalization of American companies and the growth and international reach that we've seen over the last 50, 60 years has been fantastic because it has provided opportunities it has provided opportunities in other countries. It has provided access to prosperity in other countries. If you look at U.S. investment, in places even like China, the opening to China, I would say, and the beginnings of investment in China and China's integration with the world and U.S. companies being there has had a hugely positive effect. And there is absolutely there is a sort of a transference on the questions of economic principles. Unfortunately, there is another side to that coin, and that is when companies become ambassadors for their craptastic hosts, as some have indeed done on behalf of China. Unwilling to countenance the notion that perhaps China is not a good guy, and unwilling to speak out because that would mean loss of business. So I mean, we see two sides of it, and I think on balance, the former is far more powerful, and I think it's also hugely important. We like our cheap iPhones, to use the common trope. on the other hand, I'm not too impressed at companies that think that it's totally cool to get their products based on slave labor, whether that slave labor is in Nepal or in India or in China or anywhere else. So it's a much more complex question, and it deserves a nuanced appreciation. But on balance, these things are good. We don't want companies, to only be buying and selling to Americans from Americans in America behind a wall. That is the pathway to economic and political and international perdition, to my mind.
Thank you. We have a very specific question from Tarek Abu Saleh, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. And it's about Sudan. So since independence in 1956, and Steve, I'll throw this one to you, Sudan lived 52 years under military regimes and dictatorships and only 13 years in democratic rule. Now, as you know, Sudan is in a transitional period, which will hopefully be followed by elections in 2023. In your view, what are the requirements leading to a sustainable democracy in Sudan?
I'm going to answer that question by starting by saying that I know so little about Sudan that I don't have a really well-informed opinion, and I'm therefore not going to say very much because as I said before, one of the problems that the United States has had is when we have gone in to try and promote democracy in places that we simply didn't understand particularly well. I think it was the Obama administration that helped midwife, the independence for South Sudan, and that lasted about a year before it fell back into civil war once again, because we basically didn't understand what we were attempting to create there. And in the most general sense, what any transition from an authoritarian system to a democratic system will require, apart from sort of goodwill among all the contending parties, is a set of political institutions that give the different contending power centers, and in this case, different national groups or ethnic groups within Sudan, a belief that they will have a sort of fair shot at political power commensurate with their numbers. That there has to be some kind of set of rules or institutions that will not be exploited by a majority over a minority, et cetera. I don't know enough about Sudan to know about whether or not those conditions are going to be met or not. But we do kind of know what makes democracy work, and it's harder to make it work in places that are poor, where literacy is low, where there are sort of deeply rooted divisions based on ethnicity or other religion or whatever. All of those things make it harder to put together an effective democracy and keep it sustainable over time.
Thank you. You handled that very well. And see, Danny, I'm sharing around the hard questions. So I'll wrap this up with one final question, and maybe both of you can take a crack at answering it. Your thoughts on Biden's proposed summit on the Alliance of Democracies. Is it a good idea or not? And what do you think should come out of that, if anything? Danny, we'll start with you.
Republicans have rightly been accused of not being sufficiently respectful of multilateral international organizations for a whole variety of reasons, some of them legitimate, some of them not legitimate. The other side of that coin is Democrats are endlessly in love with the symbolism of organizations and indifferent to their effectiveness. We already have a community of democracies. Okay, it's called the Community of Democracies. When I was in government, I fought with the Clinton administration because they wanted to allow Tunisia and Egypt into the Community of Democracies. Why? Not because they were democracies, but because it would be nice for them. And, no, they weren't democracies. What is a Community of Democracies delivered? Can anyone tell me anything? It's fine. It's a fine idea, but what we will end up seeing is that there'll be a lot of blather without any follow through, that there will be a lot of, what my late boss used to call making the world safe for cocktail parties. you know, I think it is nothing other than, you know, a glorified blue ribbon commission, a substitute for genuine action, and a waste of taxpayer cash.
Yeah, so this has achieved the remarkable thing of having Danny and I in complete agreement, which doesn't happen very often. I mean, I guess I don't find this a horrible idea, but it's not a very good one for a variety of reasons. First of all, we have a set of forums that can be used for this purpose, whether it's NATO, whether it's the G7, whatever. If you want to get a bunch of democracies in a room to talk about things, that's not hard to do, and you don't have to put a big S, you know, and call it a summit or anything like that. It's not clear what the agenda of such a gathering would be. Is it to promote democracy? Is it to defend democracy? What are the sort of actionable items that people are going to take? Is it to figure out what to do about the internet? We don't agree with our allies on things like that. And there's the final really tricky problem of who exactly is the guest list, right? So, you know, okay, well, the United Kingdom, Denmark, Iceland, they're all in, but you know, what do you do with Poland? What do you do with Hungary? What do you do with India in its present condition? What do you do with Israel, etc.? So there are a bunch of countries where you're not so clear that you'd be as happy welcoming them to the summit, or that there won't immediately be charges that this is a meaningless designation. So we agree completely on this one. Biden should devote his diplomatic efforts in lots of other existing forums and not try to create a big new one. Also, one final thing is, it's not clear that the United States can go to this, you know, with its head held up high in quite the way we might have at other points in our history. And that's not a very comfortable role to be in if you're the convening actor. You don't want to go there and say, hey, other fellow democracies, help me out with what's going on in my own country. So this is a bad idea.
All right, well, thank you. I'm glad we ended on a note of agreement, and thank you both so much for taking all of these questions. I know that it was a lot of ground to cover, and it's really not fair to make you answer really big questions in a short amount of time, but you both did it exceedingly well. So thank you very much, and thank you to everyone in the audience who asked great questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. Just as a reminder, our next briefing is, there we go, thank you, is Thursday, April 15th from 12 to 1, and it's with Jack Devine. He has a new book out. He used to be the former acting director and associate director of operations at the CIA. Really interesting. He's spoken to us before, so please do join. And, you know, again, our plea to everyone, we are trying to keep these briefings free and open to everyone around the world. So if you can donate, we would greatly appreciate it. We are a nonprofit. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Danny. Again, really appreciate your taking the time. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.